Picture this. A teenage girl's anguished cries pierce the darkness of Edinburgh Castle on a bitter June night in 1566. In a chamber thick with smoke and terror, 16-year-old Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, writhes on bloodied linens, her small frame convulsing as she fights to bring forth Scotland's future. The midwives whisper desperate prayers, while nobles pace outside, calculating dynasties and betrayals. This is no ordinary birth. This is the moment Europe's most watched queen, crowned at 6 days old and groomed in the glittering French court, is reduced to a child mother, her body torn open for the sake of politics. The irony cuts deep. The woman hailed for her beauty and grace now screams in agony, birthing the son who will one day unite two kingdoms while she herself remains trapped by forces beyond her control. But what dark secrets led this teenage monarch to this moment of blood and desperation? Before exploring these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you appreciate discovering the concealed realities of history, consider pressing that like button and subscribing for additional content like this. And please comment below to tell me where you're listening from. I find it amazing that we're examining these ancient stories together from various parts of the world, united across time and space by our collective curiosity about the past. The 14th of December, 1542, Linlithgow Palace trembles under the weight of tragedy. James V of Scotland lies dying at just 30 years old, his kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. In a chamber nearby, his French queen, Marie de Guise, cradles a newborn daughter, a tiny, fragile thing who has just become the most valuable political prize in Europe. 6 days later, baby Mary Stuart is crowned Queen of Scots in the Chapel Royal of Stirling Castle. The ancient crown, heavy with centuries of Scottish blood and ambition, rests impossibly large upon her infant head. Cardinals and nobles bow before a child who cannot even focus her eyes, yet already bears the weight of a nation's survival. The vultures circle immediately. Henry VIII of England demands the baby queen marry his son Edward, seeking to absorb Scotland into English dominion through matrimony rather than war. When the Scottish Parliament rejects this proposal, Henry unleashes the Rough Wooing, a campaign of devastating raids that leave Scottish towns in smoking ruins and thousands dead. Marie de Guise faces an impossible choice: keep her daughter in Scotland and watch her become a casualty of English ambition, or send her away to safety. The French court offers sanctuary, but at a price. 5-year-old Mary must be betrothed to the Dauphin Francis, making Scotland a vassal of French interests. On a foggy August morning in 1548, little Mary Stuart boards a ship at Dumbarton Castle. She waves goodbye to the only home she has ever known, her mother's tears mixing with the Scottish mist. The child queen is sailing toward a golden prison that will reshape her into something both magnificent and doomed. The French court of Henri II dazzles with its sophistication and cruelty. Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye becomes Mary's new world, a place of silk gowns and deadly politics, where courtiers smile while planning betrayals. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian queen mother, watches this Scottish interloper with calculating eyes. Mary's beauty and grace win hearts, but Catherine sees only a potential threat to French power. For 13 years, Mary grows in this glittering cage. She learns to speak French, Italian, Latin, and Spanish with perfect fluency. She masters music, dance, and poetry. She becomes the jewel of the French Renaissance, her auburn hair and striking height making her the most sought-after princess in Europe. But beneath the cultured exterior, a fundamental tragedy takes root. Mary is being educated away from her own people, her own kingdom, her own destiny. In 1558, Mary marries 15-year-old Francis, the sickly Dauphin of France. For one brief, shining moment, she is Queen of France and Scotland simultaneously, the most powerful woman in Europe. But Francis dies after barely a year on the French throne, his weak constitution finally succumbing to an ear infection. At 18, Mary is a widow, her usefulness to France suddenly diminished. Catherine de' Medici makes her feelings clear through pointed silences and withdrawn favours. The Scottish queen has become an expensive ornament in a court that no longer needs her. Mary faces a choice that will define the rest of her life: remain in France as a powerless dowager queen, or return to Scotland and reclaim her birthright. The Scotland that Mary returns to in August 1561 is nothing like the glittering French court she has known. Edinburgh Castle, perched on its ancient volcanic rock, looms dark and forbidding against grey skies. The people who line the streets to see their returning queen whisper in Scots, a language that sounds foreign to her French-trained ears. She is a Catholic monarch in a country that has embraced Protestant reform with passionate intensity. John Knox thunders from pulpits that female rule is an abomination before God. Mary attempts to navigate these treacherous waters with the diplomatic skills learned in France. She attends Protestant services while maintaining her private Catholic faith. She cultivates relationships with the powerful Protestant lords who actually govern Scotland. For 4 years, this delicate balance holds. Scotland experiences relative peace and prosperity under their tall, graceful queen who speaks with a French accent and dresses in the latest continental fashions. But Mary's counsellors whisper constantly in her ear about marriage. She is 22 years old and still childless, a dangerous situation for any monarch, but especially a female one. The succession question haunts every decision. Various suitors emerge: Eric XIV of Sweden, the Archduke Charles of Austria, Don Carlos of Spain. Each marriage proposal carries the potential to drag Scotland into someone else's war. Then Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, arrives at the Scottish court. Darnley is everything Mary has been taught to value: tall, handsome, well-educated, and Catholic. More importantly, he carries Tudor blood through his grandmother, making him a potential claimant to the English throne. A marriage between Mary and Darnley would combine 2 lines of succession and strengthen any future child's claim to rule both Scotland and England. The attraction between them is immediate and intense. Darnley charms Mary with his musical talents and courtly manners. He seems to embody the Renaissance ideal of noble masculinity. When he falls ill with measles, Mary nurses him personally, ignoring court protocol. Their relationship quickly becomes the subject of fevered speculation throughout Europe. Elizabeth I of England watches these developments with growing alarm. A Catholic union between 2 claimants to her throne represents her worst nightmare. She sends urgent messages demanding that Mary not marry without her consent, a demand that Mary, as a sovereign queen, finds insulting and illegitimate. On the 29th of July, 1565, Mary Stuart marries Henry Darnley in a private ceremony at Holyrood Palace. The 19-year-old groom and 22-year-old bride seem radiantly happy. Mary grants Darnley the title of king consort, making him technically her co-ruler. Scottish nobles who oppose the match grumble about the power granted to this English interloper, but they dare not openly challenge their queen's choice. The honeymoon period lasts barely 3 months. Darnley's charming facade crumbles with shocking speed. Beneath the handsome exterior lies a spoiled, violent young man accustomed to getting his way through tantrums and threats. He demands that Parliament grant him the crown matrimonial, which would make him king in his own right and allow him to rule Scotland even if Mary died. When the nobles refuse, Darnley's resentment turns toxic. He begins drinking heavily, disappearing for days at a time to carouse with unsavoury companions. He treats Mary's servants with contempt and shows increasingly erratic behaviour in public. Most devastatingly, he becomes violently jealous of Mary's relationship with David Rizzio, her Italian secretary and musical companion. By early 1566, Mary is pregnant with what will hopefully be the heir that Scotland desperately needs. But instead of joy, the pregnancy brings new terrors. Darnley's jealousy has twisted into paranoid rage. He becomes convinced that Rizzio is Mary's lover and that the child she carries is not his own. Scottish Protestant lords, eager to exploit this marital discord, whisper poison in Darnley's ear about Catholic conspiracies and foreign influence. The stage is set for a tragedy that will haunt Mary for the rest of her life. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 9th of March, 1566. Holyrood Palace shivers under an Edinburgh wind that seems to carry the scent of approaching doom. In her private supper chamber, Queen Mary sits heavily pregnant at a small table, sharing an intimate meal with a handful of trusted companions. David Rizzio, her Italian secretary, strums a lute softly while discussing the latest correspondence from continental courts. The candlelight flickers across his dark features, highlighting the loyalty that has made him indispensable to the Scottish Queen. Mary, now 6 months pregnant, moves carefully in her chair. The child she carries represents Scotland's future, but it has also made her vulnerable in ways she never anticipated. Her husband Darnley has grown increasingly hostile. his handsome face twisted by jealousy and alcohol into something she barely recognizes. Tonight, he sits separately, his cold eyes fixed on Rizzio with undisguised hatred. At 9 o'clock, the chamber door bursts open without ceremony. Darnley enters, followed by a group of armed nobles led by Patrick Ruthven, Earl of Cowrie, his face gaunt and eyes burning with fanatic intensity. The conspirators have come for blood, and they care nothing for the pregnant queen who might be caught in their violence. "Let it please your majesty that yonder man David come forth of your privy chamber where he has been overlong," Ruthven declares, his sword already drawn. Mary rises as quickly as her condition allows, instinctively positioning herself between the armed men and her secretary. "What offence has he made?" she demands, her voice carrying all the authority of her royal blood. Ruthven's response chills the room. "He has offended your honour, which touches the king, our sovereign, your husband." Rizzio scrambles behind Mary, clutching at her gown as the conspirators surge forward. The pregnant queen finds herself in the centre of a struggle between armed men, her hands pressed protectively to her swollen belly. Daggers flash in the candlelight as the nobles seize the terrified Italian. "Justice! Justice! Save my life, madame!" Rizzio screams, his fingers twisted in Mary's dress as they drag him toward the door. The scene descends into chaos. 56 dagger wounds will later be counted on Rizzio's body, but the first blow comes while he still clings to his queen's protection. Blood spatters Mary's gown as she watches her loyal secretary murdered before her eyes, his final cries echoing through the palace corridors. The psychological trauma of witnessing such brutality, while heavily pregnant, cannot be overstated. Mary has been raised in the refined French court, where violence is hidden behind velvet curtains and diplomatic language. Now she confronts the raw savagery that underlies all political power. The message from the conspirators is unmistakable. No one who serves the Catholic Queen is safe, not even in her private chambers. Darnley's involvement in the murder destroys their marriage irrevocably. Mary realizes that her husband not only sanctioned the killing but participated in it, caring nothing for the shock it might cause to his pregnant wife. The man she once loved has revealed himself as someone willing to endanger both her life and their unborn child's, for the sake of petty revenge. In the aftermath of Rizzio's murder, Mary demonstrates the political cunning that will define her reign. Rather than submitting to the conspirators' demands, she secretly negotiates with Darnley, exploiting his growing fear that the other nobles intend to eliminate him as well. She convinces him to help her escape Edinburgh Castle, where they have been held under guard. On the night of the 11th of March, Mary and Darnley slip away from their captors and ride through the darkness to Dunbar Castle. The midnight flight over rough Scottish terrain while 6 months pregnant requires enormous physical courage. But Mary's desperation to escape the men who murdered her secretary before her eyes drives her beyond normal human endurance. From Dunbar, Mary rallies loyal forces and returns to Edinburgh in triumph. The conspirators flee into exile, their coup attempt having failed. But the damage to Mary's sense of security is permanent. She has learned that even her private chambers offer no sanctuary from political violence, and that her own husband cannot be trusted to protect her. On the 19th of June, 1566, Mary gives birth to a son in Edinburgh Castle. The labour is difficult and dangerous, as 16th century childbirth always is, but especially traumatic given the violence she has recently witnessed. The baby who emerges will one day unite the crowns of England and Scotland as James VI and I, but his birth comes at the cost of his mother's innocence. Mary's first words upon seeing her son reveal her bitter awareness of the political realities surrounding them. "My lord, God has given you and me both a son, begotten by none but you." She speaks directly to Darnley, making clear that despite his suspicions about Rizzio, the child is legitimately his. But her tone carries no warmth, only the cold formality of a queen addressing a subject who has forfeited her personal affection. The months following James's birth see Mary's marriage to Darnley deteriorate completely. He has become an alcoholic wastrel, violent and unpredictable. Scottish nobles who initially opposed him now actively plot his removal, seeing him as a threat to the stability of the realm. Mary herself grows distant from her husband, focusing her attention on governing Scotland and raising the heir who represents the dynasty's future. By late 1566, various factions at the Scottish court are discussing what historians would later call the Darnley problem. Some whisper of divorce, though this would potentially bastardize Prince James. Others speak more darkly of permanent solutions. The Earl of Bothwell, a powerful border lord who has become Mary's most trusted military commander, emerges as the leading voice among those who believe Darnley must be eliminated. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, represents everything that Darnley is not. Where Darnley is weak and petulant, Bothwell is strong and decisive. Where Darnley seeks to advance himself through manipulation, Bothwell serves Mary's interests with apparent loyalty. Most dangerously, where Darnley has forfeited Mary's emotional attachment through cruelty and betrayal, Bothwell begins to win her affection through his unwavering support during her darkest hours. The exact nature of the relationship between Mary and Bothwell remains one of history's great mysteries. Contemporary observers noted the Queen's growing reliance on the Border Earls' Council. Protestant lords who opposed Mary later claimed that she and Bothwell were lovers, using this allegation to justify their rebellion. Catholic supporters insisted that Mary maintained perfect virtue throughout her trials. What cannot be disputed is that by early 1567, Bothwell had become the most powerful man in Scotland after the Queen herself. When various schemes are discussed for removing Darnley from the political equation, Bothwell's voice carries decisive weight. The border lord has access to loyal retainers who ask few questions about their assignments, and his position as Lieutenant of the Borders gives him resources that other nobles lack. On the 9th of February, 1567, the house at Kirkhoe Field, where Darnley has been staying, explodes in a tremendous blast that awakens half of Edinburgh. When the smoke clears and the debris is searched, Darnley's body is found in the garden, unmarked by the explosion but clearly strangled. The murder is so obviously orchestrated that it scandalizes all of Europe. Mary's reaction to her husband's death provides crucial evidence about her level of involvement in the plot. Rather than showing grief, she appears relieved to be free of a man who had made her life miserable. Rather than demanding a thorough investigation, she seems content with perfunctory inquiries that produce no meaningful results. Most damaging of all, rather than maintaining appropriate mourning, she quickly grows closer to the man widely suspected of orchestrating the murder. The Bothwell marriage represents Mary's greatest political mistake. On May 15, 1567, just 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary marries James Hepburn in a Protestant ceremony that outrages both her Catholic supporters and her Protestant subjects. The speed of the marriage, coming so soon after her husband's violent death, creates an impression of callous indifference that destroys her reputation throughout Europe. The marriage also demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of Scottish political realities. Mary seems to believe that Bothwell's military strength will allow them to govern Scotland through force if necessary. She fails to recognise that the Scottish nobles will never accept being dominated by one of their own number, regardless of his relationship to the Queen. Within a month, Confederate lords raise the banner of rebellion against Mary and Bothwell. Their propaganda portrays the Queen as a murderous adulteress who has betrayed both her late husband and her infant son. The slogan, "Avenge Darnley's murder," becomes a rallying cry that attracts supporters from across the political spectrum. The confrontation comes at Carberry Hill on the 15th of June, 1567. Mary and Bothwell arrive with a small force, expecting to face down the rebels through royal authority and military superiority. Instead, they find themselves outnumbered and abandoned. Many of their supporters melt away when faced with the prospect of civil war. As negotiations drag on through the scorching June day, Mary realizes that her political position has become untenable. The Confederate lords offer her a choice: abandon Bothwell and submit to their authority, or face the consequences of defying the unified Scottish nobility. The farewell between Mary and Bothwell at Carberry Hill marks the end of her active reign as Queen of Scots. Whether their relationship was based on genuine affection or political calculation, it has cost Mary everything she once possessed. Bothwell flees into exile, eventually dying mad and imprisoned in a Danish castle. Mary surrenders to the Confederate lords, who march her into Edinburgh amid crowds shouting, "Burn the adulteress!" On the 24th of July, 1567, Mary is forced to sign documents abdicating her throne in favour of her 13-month-old son James. The ceremony takes place in the grim island fortress of Loch Leven Castle, where she has been imprisoned by the lords who once swore fealty to her. The woman who was crowned Queen of Scots at 6 days old formally renounces her crown at 24 years of age. The psychological destruction of this moment cannot be overstated. Mary has been defined by queenship since infancy. Every aspect of her education, her marriage, her motherhood has been shaped by royal necessity. Now she must sign away not only her political power but her very identity, acknowledging that she is no longer worthy to rule the kingdom that is her birthright. As autumn turns to winter in Lochleven Castle, Mary stares across the dark waters of the loch and contemplates a future that stretches before her like an endless prison sentence. The teenage bride, who once seemed destined to unite two kingdoms, has instead lost the one crown she was born to wear. But even in defeat, Mary Stuart refuses to accept that her story is over. On May 2, 1568, Mary Stuart achieves what seems impossible. She escapes from Lochleven Castle. With the help of romantic young supporters led by George Douglas, the deposed queen slips away from her island prison disguised as a servant. For a brief moment, it appears that the woman who lost everything might reclaim her throne through sheer force of will and the loyalty of those who still believe in her cause. The escape electrifies Scotland. Mary's supporters rally to her banner with surprising speed, raising an army of 6,000 men within days. The Confederate lords who deposed her suddenly face the terrifying prospect that their political gamble might fail. If Mary regains power, they can expect no mercy for the humiliations they have inflicted upon her. But Mary's military campaign proves as tragically flawed as her political decisions. At the Battle of Langside on May 13, 1568, her forces meet those of the Regent Moray in what becomes a decisive 45-minute engagement. Mary watches from a nearby hilltop as her army disintegrates under disciplined volleys from experienced soldiers. The dream of restoration dies in the Scottish countryside, crushed by the superior tactics of men who once served her. Faced with capture and probable execution, Mary makes the decision that will define the rest of her life. Rather than fleeing to France or seeking sanctuary in Catholic Europe, she chooses to cross the border into England. Her reasoning seems sound. Elizabeth I is her cousin and fellow queen, surely bound by ties of kinship and royal solidarity to offer assistance against rebellious subjects. The decision reveals Mary's fundamental misunderstanding of the political realities surrounding her situation. Elizabeth has spent her entire reign navigating the treacherous currents of religious division and foreign intrigue. The last thing she needs is a Catholic rival with legitimate claims to the English throne seeking refuge in her kingdom. But Mary, desperate and exhausted after years of struggle, sees only the hope of sanctuary. On May 16, 1568, Mary crosses the Solway Firth in a small fishing boat. The former Queen of Scots lands on English soil with nothing but the clothes on her back and the jewels sewn into her undergarments. She immediately writes to Elizabeth, expressing confidence that her dear sister will help restore her to her rightful throne. Elizabeth's response reveals the careful calculation that has kept her on the English throne for a decade. She cannot simply restore Mary without investigating the charges against her, particularly the allegations of complicity in Darnley's murder, but neither can she turn away a fellow queen seeking sanctuary. Instead, Elizabeth chooses a middle course that will trap Mary in England for the next 19 years. The trial that follows represents a masterpiece of political theatre. Elizabeth establishes a commission to investigate the charges against Mary, knowing full well that the proceedings will produce no definitive resolution. The Scottish lords present their evidence, including the controversial casket letters allegedly written by Mary to Bothwell. Mary's representatives argue that these documents are forgeries designed to justify rebellion against lawful authority. The commission reaches exactly the conclusion that Elizabeth desires. The evidence is insufficient to convict Mary of murder, but also insufficient to prove her innocence. This allows Elizabeth to maintain Mary under house arrest indefinitely, neither recognizing her guilt nor accepting her claim to restored queenship. Mary's English captivity begins at Carlisle Castle in 1568 and continues through a series of increasingly secure locations until her death in 1587. The early years offer some hope that her situation might improve. Mary maintains her own household, corresponds with supporters throughout Europe, and continues to style herself Queen of Scots. She embroiders, writes poetry, and maintains the cultural refinements that made her famous in her youth. But as the years pass, the psychological toll of captivity becomes evident. Mary's health deteriorates under the stress of confinement and uncertainty. She suffers from a painful condition in her side that may have been arthritis or kidney problems. More devastating than physical illness is the gradual erosion of hope that characterizes long-term imprisonment. The political landscape shifts around Mary in ways that make her position increasingly precarious. The Street Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 hardens Protestant sentiment against Catholic plotting. The papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth in 1570 makes Mary a focal point for Catholic resistance to Protestant rule. Every conspiracy against Elizabeth, whether real or imagined, increases suspicion of the captive Scottish Queen. Mary's presence in England creates what modern strategists would recognize as a classic security dilemma. Her mere existence encourages Catholic plots against Elizabeth's rule, yet eliminating her would create international complications that Elizabeth desperately wishes to avoid. The English Queen walks a tightrope for nearly 2 decades, maintaining Mary's captivity while resisting pressure for more permanent solutions. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and other conspiracies swirl around Mary whether she actively participates or not. Each revelation of Catholic intrigue further isolates the Scottish Queen and strengthens arguments for treating her as a security threat rather than a fellow sovereign deserving protection. By the mid-1582, Mary's situation has become desperate. Parliament passes legislation making it treason to plot against Elizabeth's life, with the clear intention of providing legal justification for executing Mary if she becomes involved in another conspiracy. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, actively seeks evidence that will allow him to spring this legislative trap. The Babington plot of 1586 provides Walsingham with exactly the evidence he needs. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman, develops a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne with Spanish support. When Babington writes to Mary outlining his plans, her reply appears to endorse the assassination plot, providing the smoking gun that Walsingham has long sought. Modern historians debate whether Mary's letter truly constitutes proof of treasonous intent, or whether it represents the desperate response of a woman driven to extremity by nearly 2 decades of captivity. What cannot be disputed is that the letter provides Elizabeth's government with legal justification for proceedings that end with Mary's execution. The trial of Mary Stuart takes place at Fotheringhay Castle in October 1586. Mary initially refuses to participate, arguing that, as a sovereign queen, she cannot be tried by English courts. When she finally agrees to present her defence, she maintains her innocence while acknowledging that years of imprisonment have made her eager for any resolution, even death. The trial's outcome is predetermined, but Mary's conduct during the proceedings reminds observers of the dignity that once made her the jewel of European courts. She appears in black velvet, her hair now grey but her bearing still regal. When the inevitable guilty verdict is announced, she receives it with composure that impresses even her enemies. Elizabeth's anguish over signing Mary's death warrant reveals the genuine complexity of their relationship. Despite the political necessities that have kept Mary imprisoned, Elizabeth recognizes their kinship as fellow queens struggling to survive in a world dominated by men. The English Queen delays the execution for months, seeking alternatives that might preserve both Mary's life and England's security. But the pressure from Parliament and Privy Council proves irresistible. The Babington plot has demonstrated that Mary's continued existence represents an unacceptable security risk. On the 1st of February 1587, Elizabeth finally signs the death warrant, though she later claims that her secretary sent it without her authorization. The execution takes place on the 8th of February 1587 in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary faces her death with the courage that has sustained her through decades of struggle. She dresses in crimson, the colour of Catholic martyrdom, and carries herself with the dignity of the Queen she has remained in her own mind despite years of captivity. Her final speech reveals the complex layers of her identity. She forgives her enemies while maintaining her innocence of the charges against her. She prays for Elizabeth's welfare while expressing hope that England will one day return to the Catholic faith. Most movingly, she commends her soul to God while acknowledging the son she has barely known who will inherit her claims to both Scottish and English thrones. The execution itself becomes a final symbol of the cruelties that have defined Mary's life. The executioner's first blow strikes the back of her head rather than her neck. The The second blow severs most of her neck, but leaves sinews that must be cut with the axe blade. When the executioner lifts what he believes to be Mary's head, her wig comes away in his hands, revealing the grey hair of a woman aged far beyond her 44 years by suffering and confinement. Even in death, Mary Stuart remains a figure of controversy and political calculation. Elizabeth orders elaborate funeral rites while privately expressing relief at the resolution of a problem that has haunted her reign for 2 decades. Catholic Europe mourns a martyr, while Protestant England celebrates the elimination of a threat to religious settlement. The ultimate irony of Mary's tragedy becomes clear within 16 years of her death. In 1603, her son James VI of Scotland inherits the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns that his mother's struggles failed to bring together. The woman who lost everything in her attempts to secure dynastic success ultimately achieves through death what eluded her in life. Mary's legacy transcends the political failures that defined her active reign. Her story becomes a touchstone for debates about female power, religious conflict, and the moral costs of political necessity. The teenage bride, who seemed destined for greatness instead, becomes a cautionary tale about the price of political miscalculation in an age when queens were expected to be both sovereign rulers and submissive wives. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Mary's tragedy is how thoroughly it demonstrates the machinery of power grinding down human life. From her coronation as a 6-day-old infant to her execution as a middle-aged prisoner, Mary Stuart was never permitted to exist as simply a human being. She was always first and foremost a political asset to be deployed, captured, or eliminated according to the calculations of others. The teenage queen, who once dazzled the French court with her beauty and accomplishments, died on an executioner's block, her final words drowned out by the sound of axes and the prayers of witnesses. Her story serves as an eternal reminder that even the most privileged lives can become casualties of forces too large and ruthless for any individual to control. In the end, Mary Queen of Scots achieved a form of immortality denied to most monarchs, not through military conquest or political achievement, but through the sheer human drama of a life that encompassed every extreme of fortune and misfortune that fate could devise. Her tragedy continues to fascinate because it reminds us that behind every crown lies a human heart, vulnerable to the same hopes, fears, and sufferings that define us all. If you enjoyed the story of Mary Stuart, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.